Hi, I'm Bill O'Reilly reporting tonight from Los Angeles. Thank you for watching us. So here's what we're going to do this evening. Because we're out here on the West Coast and things are happening quickly in North Carolina, we're going to go live to Bret Baier for on-the-scene coverage this evening of the racial controversy in Charlotte. Then I will reappear and we'll have some excellent coverage of the presidential campaign and of the upcoming debate. But first, the talking points memo: unacceptable behavior. For the past 2 nights, protests over a police shooting in Charlotte have spiraled into chaos. Looting and violence have broken out, resulting in scores of arrests, at least 5 police officers injured, and 9 civilians hurt as well, 1 in critical condition. The controversy began on Tuesday after police killed 43-year-old Keith Scott, shooting him to death after he allegedly brandished a handgun. The police chief of Charlotte, Kerr Putney, has been adamant that Mr. Scott, who had previous run-ins with the law, was armed. But today the chief backed off a little bit.
I was very clear when I talked about this before, is the video does not give me absolute definitive visual evidence that would confirm that a person is pointing a gun. I did not see that in the videos that I've reviewed.
But Chief Putney still insists Mr. Scott did have a gun. Reaction from the black community came quickly.
In my mind and in most of the community's mind, it really doesn't matter if he had a gun. End of the day, we have the right under the Second Amendment to carry North Carolina, and their responsibility was to engage him in a more de-escalated way.
Minister Mack is correct on one point and wrong on another. It certainly does matter if the dead man was carrying a gun. But she is correct when she says that police do have an obligation to de-escalate confrontations if they can. But what every responsible American should agree with is you cannot break the law by looting, setting things on fire, harming people under any circumstances. Fair-minded people know you let the investigation play out. You gather facts. In the Ferguson case, for example, once the facts were known, the myth that Michael Brown had his hands up and was not causing trouble was dispelled. Now, I am fully aware that some African Americans don't trust the police or the investigative process in general, and some have good reasons not to trust. But that does not give you license to go on a rampage. Just today in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the police officer who shot an unarmed black man last week was charged with murder herself. She will now stand trial. That is our system. If you reject the system and begin to commit crimes in the name of protest, you should be punished. Not to mention that it hurts your own cause, because mob violence will always override any kind of singular injustice. Both presidential candidates reacted not only to Charlotte, but also to the killing in Oklahoma.
There is still much we don't know about what happened in both incidents, but we do know that we have 2 more names to add to a list of African Americans killed by police officers in these encounters. It's unbearable, and it needs to become intolerable.
The people who will suffer the most as a result of these riots are law-abiding African American residents who live in these communities where the crime is so rampant. There is no compassion in tolerating lawless conduct.
Quite a contrast between Secretary Clinton and Mr. Trump. Summing up, violence in Charlotte is deplorable. Sincere protest, admirable. Looting and hurting other people, unacceptable completely. And that's the memo. Now for continuing coverage of the Charlotte situation, we go live to my colleague Bret Baier in Washington. Bret, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. We'll head back to you in California in just a few minutes. There are, in fact, new developments tonight. Police have not released any video of the shooting to the public in North Carolina, but Fox News has confirmed that just a short time ago, the family of Keith Scott reviewed 2 police videos from a dash cam and a body cam. The family just moments ago released a statement saying that while police did give Mr. Scott several commands, he did not aggressively approach them or raise his hand hands at police at any time. Again, from the family statement. They say it's impossible to tell what he was holding in his hands, if anything. The family states in this release that after watching the videos, they have more questions than answers. We have also just learned moments ago that the victim who Bill mentioned in his talking points, who was in critical condition, has now died. Joining us live from Charlotte, Fox News correspondent Steve Harrigan, and from Miami, defense attorney Andell Brown. Steve, first to you, what are you hearing about this tape and the family's reaction?
Brett, from the family's reaction through their attorneys, they're saying they can't really comment one way or the other on what this video reveals. It's inconclusive in their view. That's from the attorneys. And we can give you a sense of the mood here right now. This is the spot where that protester was shot to death last night. Not clear by whom. A crowd of about 300 people gathered, and it seems to be growing steadily. As you can see, the street's still open for business here. Major protests haven't started. One new thing we are seeing here on the streets, though, the presence of the National Guard in camouflage with helmets, armored Humvees, and rifles over their shoulders. So a sign of the promised force from authorities here, the presence of National Guard on the streets of downtown Charlotte. Brett?
You know, Steve, the governor was out today alongside the mayor there and other officials. They said and forecasted that this was going to be a big show of force here. Is there a sense that it's a lot different than last night and that perhaps the crowds are a little smaller?
The crowds are smaller now, but it's hard to predict whether that will change or not. They certainly are promising more force, more numbers due to the state of emergency, the National Guard, as well as the State Highway Patrol. It was clear that the police were outmanned last night. It took them 4 hours here to clear just about 4 blocks. And there were motorists really being attacked on part of the highway that circles the city. The police chief himself admitting they simply didn't have the numbers to deal with it. So we could see a much stronger show of force early in the night tonight. Keep in mind the violence kicked off last night just before 9 p.m. here, so the crowd's still gathering, Brett.
Okay, Steve, stand by if you will. Andell, I want to go to you and your reaction to what's happening in North Carolina. It seems like North Carolina is a different story than in Tulsa, where this police officer has now been charged with felony manslaughter.
Yeah, we have 2 different cases, obviously, and in Tulsa, the difference that we've seen in many cases is that there was a video that people can look at and evaluate, and the authorities and the community could come to a decision. Here in Charlotte, we have a community that is frustrated and angry and distrustful of the police in the process. However, it is never a solution to riot, to act violently and to attack people. But it is, however, a symptom of when people think that the process is not there to protect and serve them, but the system is only protecting and serving itself. That's part of what we have.
Earlier tonight, we're looking at video from some of these riots and protests for the past couple of days. Earlier tonight, Donald Trump was talking about this, and he said to our colleague Lou Dobbs that he extends his hand to every mayor who wants to make a city safer. To do this, you have to work with the police, not against the police. And he suggests that those peddling narratives of cops as racist force, is a narrative that is supported by his opponent, Hillary Clinton. Obviously, the Clinton campaign pushes back hard against that. But your thoughts about this and this, what Trump calls a narrative, that all police forces are somehow after black men and women on the streets?
I don't know where Trump is getting that narrative from. I certainly and many other like-minded individuals have not put forth that narrative. Police are individuals, they're human beings, some are good, some are bad. However, when we don't have transparency and accountability, the community can't tell the difference. When you have African Americans who are going through the criminal justice system at a rate higher than other people, they're encountering police officers more than other people, obviously they're going to be more concerned in that community. Many people feel as if African Americans don't get the same consideration and the value to their life and their safety that other people get. It's not that all officers are bad, it's that some are bad, and when we don't have transparency and accountability, we can't tell the difference. We've seen cases where the police reports have said one thing, like Walter Scott or Laquan McDonald, but the camera has shown us another thing. We need more transparency, and that's what the community is looking for, and that's what they deserve.
And of course, we've seen cases the other way as well. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. Steve will head back for breaking news. Up next, we'll take you back to Charlotte for an update on the situation there with Mike Tobin, who's looking at a situation from a different vantage point as the O'Reilly Factor continues. Continuing now with our lead story, the situation in Charlotte after 2 nights of violent protest over a police shooting of a black man. Again, the breaking news, the man shot in the head during last night's protests, according to police, has died. Right now, the streets are teeming with police and National Guardsmen, an effort that was forecast today by the governor and the mayor, an effort to keep the peace. Let's go to Fox News correspondent Mike Tobin, live from Charlotte. Also from Charlotte, Speaker of the North Carolina House, State Representative Tim Moore, and from our studios in New York City, civil rights attorney Eric Guster. Let's begin with Mike. Mike, your sense on the streets right now?
Well, one of the things we just heard moments ago is a chant they were doing is release the video. Of course, very relevant to the fact that the family just saw the video, and the people out here want to put some pressure on the police chief to release it. He says, of course, he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to set the precedent, and he doesn't want to taint the investigation. The crowd out here is about 100 people strong. Police presence right here, I would say, is fairly light. We saw some bike cops, not with the heavy riot gear on. They're trying to keep themselves scarce for the moment, but you got to know that the police are very aware of what's happening out here. Now, very relevant to what's happening out here is the death of Justin Carr. That's the individual who was shot during the demonstrations last night, and we got confirmation today that he died. There are 2 different versions of how he was shot. The police version is that he was shot by another civilian out here on the streets. What the demonstrators believe here is that he was shot in the head with a rubber bullet shot by the police. So therefore, they're not dissuaded from what they're doing because they believe it shows just what they're up against. The people out here are very passionate. They believe that there should be a very intelligent man I spoke with said he believes that it's understandable that cops get edgy, that cops get nervous working the street, but they should be held to another standard. Their training should be more significant, and you wouldn't have situations like that. So the familiar refrain right now, no justice, no peace, no racist police. We've heard that many times. A crowd about 100 people strong. Right now they're marching, not a large presence of police. Right?
Okay, Mike Tobin, I'm sure you can hear that well with that bullhorn at your ear. North Carolina Speaker of the House, Tim Moore. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are people in North Carolina who say that the GOP there in the state has this law that's making it more difficult to put out police videos. Your response to that?
Good evening, Brett. First off, I want to join the group of folks calling for calm in Charlotte this evening and thanking our law enforcement for the job they're doing to protect all of us. The bill that was passed this past year was passed on a bipartisan basis. Out of 120 members in the House, 88 members voted for it, so it was strongly bipartisan. And in fact, that legislation created a mechanism where that information could be obtained by the public. That law, interestingly enough, does not go into effect until October 1st. So right now we're dealing with a period prior to that law, and it's right now entirely up to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department whether or not they release that video.
Yeah, so the ACLU a little off base there. Eric, you see this. You've seen the different incidents here. There are reports out of Charlotte that a lot of the people arrested are actually from outside the state of North Carolina. Have you seen this?
I have seen that report, but this is a nationwide type of issue that we're dealing with, Brett. Police brutality and police mistreatment and police misconduct, those things are things that every citizen who's African American has dealt with. And so when you have protests such as this, when you have people who've been shot and killed, such as Terrence Crutcher, such as Keith Scott, you have people who are very passionate about what they believe in. And going to Charlotte, this is something, Charlotte is not a very difficult city to drive to fly to. So I'm not necessarily shocked that a lot of people come from out of town, because it's a destination that a lot of people visit for the CIAA tournament. So it's very well known, and a lot of people like myself who visit Charlotte on a semi-regular basis understand the tensions that are there. Charlotte is a good city, but we have to come together and do a better job of policing.
Mr. Speaker, is there any solution that state lawmakers are talking about with the governor that potentially gets to something about community policing, that gets to some of these people who feel like they're being wronged by the police forces?
Well, certainly the body camera legislation that we passed last year was a bipartisan approach to try to do exactly just that. And I find it ironic that some on the left are trying to turn that around into an issue somehow going for confidentiality. In fact, many Democrats championed that legislation in the General Assembly. But, you know, in response to some of the other comments, I understand the right of folks who want to go out and they want to protest, and that's appropriate. But what's not appropriate? What's not appropriate at all is the rioting that's happening, the violence. I know a gentleman has died as a result of this, and there's just no sense in it. And I'll contrast it with this. I represent a county about 30 minutes away from Charlotte, and we had a police officer killed in the line of duty about 10 days ago. Our response was a prayer vigil for that officer and for the whole community. That's what we need, not violence.
But we don't know what happened with that shooting. We don't know if it was a rubber bullet. We don't know if it was from a private citizen. So let's not jump to conclusions about what happened with that man who died.
Yeah, Eric and Speaker Moore, thank you both for being here. The key point is we hope it doesn't get violent tonight. All of us do. We'll continue our live coverage of the situation in Charlotte in just a moment. This is a Fox News Alert. You're looking live at Charlotte there as the crowds are increasing on the ground. We are continuing our live coverage in this, the third night of protests, some of them turning violent over the past 2 nights. We're hoping that is not the case tonight, but the crowds are gathering. There are a lot of police, a lot of National Guardsmen on the streets of Charlotte tonight. We were scheduled to go back to Bill O'Reilly in California, but because of the developing situation, we're going to stick with this for the time being. Let's go back to our Fox News correspondent, Mike Tobin, live on the streets with the protesters. Mike, are you seeing things a lot differently than last night as far as the presence, the numbers, on both sides?
I would say that the numbers are down today. This was kind of an organic demonstration that sprung up over social media. It was organized largely by a woman you can see in the middle there, the woman with the lighter colored hair. That is Sherelle Brown, and she comes in from Greensboro. Actually, she just moved out of the shot. But it was organized by some people from around the state, not necessarily entirely locally, but it does seem to be fairly organic the way it all sprung up. But at the time they started marching, I ballparked their figure here at about 100 people. Now, as far as police presence that we see, I would say it's a very light police presence, and I would imagine on the part of the police that is very deliberate. If they're out here on the street in large numbers, that's going to cause friction with the demonstrators, and they're going to give the demonstrators somebody to conflict with. So as usually is the technique, the police are probably somewhere nearby here ready to move if there's trouble, but as the people are just marching in the middle of the street chanting, there's no reason for them to get involved. So thus far, all we have seen is people marching, chanting, letting their opinion be known, and no incident beyond that, Brett.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Steve Harrigan on a different block said about 300 people where he is. Andel Brown is still with us in Miami. Andel, if the police department decides not to put out this video that the family saw today, what about that?
Well, I mean, it's a tough call. Obviously, they're in charge of the investigation, but really we have such a high level of curiosity as to what that video shows. The family attorney is not commenting on it. The community really wants answers. Luckily, it seems like we're in a much better place tonight where we only have maybe 100 people, and it doesn't seem to be any violence at this point in time. But I don't see how the investigation is tainted by the community being able to see what's on the video. The people that are making the decisions will look at the video independent of anyone in the community.
Yeah, well, we should say the attorney did put out a statement saying that the family viewed it and they just couldn't determine whether he had a gun or not, or whether he made an aggressive move or not. And they're saying they have more questions than answers tonight. So they did see the video. Back to North Carolina Speaker of the House, Tim Moore. What about you? Should these videos be put out right away?
You know, we have a process now that we've recently adopted so that can happen. And frankly, you know, it's probably in the best interest of law enforcement to actually release that video at some point. And so I know they're trying to go through their investigation, and you know, that's why we have to let the process work. But I think eventually it will certainly be released, probably sooner than later, and that's probably what needs to happen.
Eric Guster, civil rights attorney, do you sense that this is somehow all connected in the minds of the African American community, that there is not this delineation between each individual incident as these investigations go forward?
Yes, because back to the, may I answer your question in reference to the video. It is so important, Brett, for them to release this video. Walter Scott was shot and killed last year, and the police officer gave a statement that was totally contrary to what we saw on video. That is one of the reasons that so many African Americans simply don't trust the police officers to give their version. For example, in this statement that the police chief gave in his press conference early today, I was baffled by why did this man say we are not going to be totally transparent. He said we'll be transparent, but not totally transparent. Brett, that's the problem that the African American community and so many other poor communities have with police officers, because there may be a lack of transparency. And when you have video, several video angles, you have chest cams, you have dash cams, those are things that can easily be released within hours and will not take the investigation.
But you understand their point. They don't want to inflame things on the street. If the video is inconclusive and the investigation is continuing, they think by releasing the video, perhaps they get more of a violent response in the short term on the streets of Charlotte.
Well, let's look at the response right now. It's violent right now.
Well,
but
right
just
now,
like
it's okay.
just like Chicago, when Laquan McDonald, when in the Chicago shooting, the police chief came on and said, "Look, this is bad. This is horrible, but we're going to release it so we can be transparent to you." That is what people need. They need that type of leadership, because leadership comes in times of turmoil, not when everything is bed of roses and petals. This is when leadership is needed for people to come out and say, look, this is bad. We're going to show it to you, and we're going to let the process work. But when you tell someone who doesn't believe you, hey, just we have a video, but we're not going to show it to you, that is what concerns people, and that's what makes people even more angry.
Gentlemen, stand by if you would. We'll continue our live coverage of the situation in Charlotte from all angles right here on Fox News Channel. On covering these events, Steve Harrigan is joining us now from the streets of Charlotte. Steve, you've been in a bunch of these things, dealing with tear gas, dealing with protesters, rioters, looters. It is a perspective that is key to have. You know, how big an area are we talking here?
A small area. We spent much of the night last night really on just 4 blocks, and it took the police force about 4 or 5 hours to clear that. So we're talking about a small area and small numbers as well. You can get the impression sometimes from pictures that the whole city is aflame. That's not the case. Right now we're looking at about 100 protesters, a lot of people, bystanders with cameras, interested parties, and about 25 police officers. These small standoffs, tense confrontations are happening in different parts of the city, which makes it very tough to control. So far, no violence here tonight. The police have vowed a much tougher presence and more arrests. We are seeing the National Guard in camouflage, helmets, and rifles with armored vehicles, but we are not seeing any arrests yet. It's still a little bit early. The numbers so far not high. I'd say overall 200 or 300 protesters in scattered points across the city, Brett.
All right, Steve, but weigh in on this guy's complaint that the media, by shining a light on this and putting our live cameras there, and we are covering this live right now, is stirring up some of the people who show up. And they sometimes come from out of state, and they're looking to make a point, a stand. And then it gets violent later in the night when it just turns that way. I mean, your thoughts about that?
I think some people do play to the camera, and when you put camera on some people, it does make them do things they ordinarily wouldn't do. But if you see, everyone has a camera up, everyone has their iPhone up, everyone is rolling on every movement of every police officer. And part of the problem is people have been posting stuff sometimes online that is false, and it has citing problems as well. So I think there's guilt to go all around in the way this has been covered. But one thing that really has changed, and that is people are posting directly and viewing directly without really fact. There's a whole new way to reach other people. Some people would say less accurately and more dangerously and recklessly. We've seen posts from a woman who alleged to be the daughter of the man killed, making a lot of claims that so far have not panned out to be true. So it's changing things when people become the journalists and people post directly, and there's not a lot of checks and balances in place. There's not a lot of filters or editing going on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Social media has changed our entire perception of things. Mike Tobin, if you're still with me, you mentioned the uncertainty about the man who now has died from being shot in the head last night and trying to figure out how exactly that happened.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I think there's a narrative out here on the street that they want to blame that one on the police. And that's the narrative that they're accepting. They believe that it was a rubber bullet. They believe that the police shot him, and that ultimately resulted in his death. Now, the official version that we got of that is that was civilian on civilian. And we haven't got a lot of clarity as far as what kind of round was fired and what brought it about, or whether there's a suspect that police are zeroing in on or in custody. We just don't have a lot of information to that effect, Brett.
Two of our best on the streets covering this live situation in Charlotte. Stand by if we will. We'll also bring in Juan Williams and other guests as our continuing coverage of the situation in Charlotte rolls on here on Fox News Channel in just a moment. You're looking live in Charlotte as police are on the move here. Also, National Guardsmen out in force in Charlotte. The mayor suggested this would happen. The governor, McCrory, said this would happen, and it has happened. They have a significant presence, we're told, on the street. The protesters in this one area are about 100. Maybe those numbers are increasing a bit, but so far not violent, according to our people on the ground. Joining us now, Juan Williams, co-host with The Five, Fox News contributor. Juan, your thoughts on this, as now we're on our third night here in Charlotte, and we know that the family has watched this video.
Right.
They can't come to a conclusion on what exactly it shows. As the police actually said, it was not conclusive. We also know that the man who was shot in the head last night has now died. And we know in Tulsa, a separate incident, a police officer has now been charged with first-degree manslaughter. Put this in perspective.
Well, we've been through now really more than a year. If you go all the way back to Trayvon Martin, and then you come through Ferguson, you go through New York City, the Staten Island incident, and you just keep going, and what you have now is this is the #1 political issue in Black America. It is clearly encroached in terms of our political discussion at the presidential level. We have an election coming up in about 50 days. And even today, you saw both candidates responding to it. But what it clearly signals, and I think this is the difficulty for a lot of people, is that this issue has sort of exploded on the national scene in a way that we have not seen before. It's not about any one place at this moment. It's almost as if you could say, well, why not riots in Tulsa as opposed to Charlotte? But in fact, what we're seeing is that even as they have had the indictment of the police officer in Tulsa, things are up in the air because of questions about transparency and honesty by the police in Charlotte. Now, I'm struck by the idea that the candidates here, Clinton and Trump, Clinton says we got to do more in terms of protocols for police and community policing.
Yeah, I'm going to play a soundbite here from Donald Trump earlier tonight.
Okay.
Those peddling the narrative of cops as a racist force in our society, and this is a narrative that is supported with a nod by my opponent.
Right.
He's saying essentially that that Hillary Clinton supports this cops are racist in coming after black communities.
Well, I don't think that's fair, but I think that what is clear is that she is trying to be a voice for people who feel they have not been heard, that if you are in poor but largely black and Latino communities and claim that there's been excessive use of force by police, that for the most part, what you see is that people say, no, you know, if there's any question here, any doubt, the benefit of the doubt goes to the police. They are the thin blue line that protects most of us in this society from elements of crime and chaos. And so,
right. So how does the Trump law and order pitch work? I mean, how does it play politically in a place like North Carolina that's experiencing now its third night of protests? Obviously, the force is out in great numbers tonight, but as you look at the numbers in the latest poll in North Carolina, when you ask registered black voters in North Carolina who you're going to support, 82% say Clinton, 3% say Trump, 4% say Gary Johnson, 1% other, 2% aren't going to vote, and 9% say they just don't know.
Well, you know, to me, what you're seeing here is, one, the black community, and Donald Trump has been trying to reach out to the black community in recent days, but what you have here is the black community almost completely behind Hillary Clinton and feeling, I think in response to her mother's movement and the like, that she has become a voice for their sense of legitimate grievance that the police use excessive force and get away with it when dealing with poor Latinos and blacks.
But isn't there a chance, Juan, that backfires? That backfires in places that it might not have been an issue. But the fact that she is going that far down that road, that it backfires in other places that cause her electoral problems in other states.
Well, I'm not sure about this. Now, remember, they're talking to different audiences. And again, Trump has emphasized the law and order message. And at this moment, I think so many people are disquieted by the sights we've seen in Charlotte the last 2 nights, the chaos, the anarchy, the sense that there are people who delight in destruction of property. That's just uncomfortable for everybody. But at the same time, Britt, you can't get away from the idea of the legitimate complaint. So if Hillary Clinton at the moment is trying to say to people that she has more capacity to bring the races together and that Donald Trump is more of a polarizing force, and especially, remember, she's talking to suburban white women, some of them whom are Republicans or lean right. She's trying to reassure them that, you know what, it's a better bet to go with me than to go with Trump. And I think that's why I don't see it.
Trump's making his case to African-American communities as well. 10 seconds here. Do you think this is a big issue in the debate on Monday? It
has to come up. I mean, one of the things that I think the moderator has to do when he's talking about the state of America, Lester Holt, is come to this idea that we are facing an issue that threatens the stability of our nation, the tensions between the races.
Juan Williams, as always, thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
We'll continue our live coverage of the situation in Charlotte as you look live. Resistance is beautiful, and that sign, we've got it covered from all angles here on Fox. You're looking live in Charlotte, North Carolina, as we continue our coverage of the situation there as police presence, National Guardsmen on the streets in big numbers. Looking at my Twitter feed, Penny Deplorable says it was a war zone last night. Peaceful protests don't result in shooting, looting, burning things down, or destroying other people's property. Other people saying, turn off the cameras and they'll all go home. There is a lot of coverage of this, obviously, as our third night here, and watching it closely to see what happens on the ground. Mike Tobin in one area, Steve Harrigan in another. Mike, to you.
Well, it looks, the streets are a little bit bare right now, as you can see by Bob Lee's camera at the moment. One of the demonstrators said that they all just decided to go back to the park. You saw that confrontation with the police who were staging in one particular area, and that seemed to kind of break up the demonstration. Some people were interested in confronting the police officers who were standing there. Some of the demonstrators were interested in marching, and they kept going. So kind of divided them up a bit. I don't see a large mass of demonstrators at any point. They just seem to kind of deposited themselves at different places in the on the street here in the Uptown area. When I was talking to you before about the bicycle police, who seem to have a soft profile, if you will, that's what I was talking about. No riot gear, just plain old bicycle helmets and the bike standard bike cop gear. Brett.
Okay, that's good news. Steve Harrigan, over to you.
Brett, we're seeing really different levels of force out here on the street. National Guard in full camouflage with helmets and rifles, up-armored Humvees, a lot of bicycle police, and a lot of police in riot gear as well. So different levels of force ready for the use. They were promised a much heavier security presence after what happened last night. About 4 hours of back and forth with mace, with tear gas, really trying to take over one city street and unable to do that for about 4 hours. So far, the show of force seems to have calmed things down. It is not a very tense mood right now on the street, not large numbers of protesters, not organized, not chanting. Traffic is still moving, no curfew in effect. So for now, the show of force, the show of heavy security has kept things quiet so far, Brett.
You know, when you've seen these things, Steve, you know, the third night, when they really crack down, people start to get it, right? They stay home, they get out of the way, they listen for the most part.
I would challenge that. I would say that people don't get it when they crack down and that they come back for more. We saw these crowds of about anywhere from 100 to 800 last night keep coming back for more when the police fired the tear gas and the mace and the rubber bullets. I think it's when you have a presence of an overwhelming force, like when you see the real force out tonight, National Guard every few yards, and a huge police presence, that's what makes people get it. When you don't have to fight, when you're so strong, when you have such a visible presence. I think that's helping so far. Things could spark. They sparked last night around this time, but so far the heavy show of force has made it ridiculous, I think, to try and do something right now.
Steve, Mike, thank you. We'll continue our coverage from Charlotte in just a moment. Looking live in Charlotte, North Carolina there as the protests continue so far, as we've been mentioning, a peaceful demonstration. Earlier tonight on ABC, President Obama weighed in an interview touching on what has happened in Charlotte.
The way we change the system requires us to be able to reach out and engage the broader American community, and that requires being peaceful. That requires being thoughtful about what are the specific reforms you're looking for. The overwhelming majority of people who've been concerned about police-community relations doing it the right way. Every once in a while you see folks doing it the wrong way.
Back with Juan Williams in New York. Juan, not to put this on President Obama, but I've heard African Americans in different communities around the country say that they have not seen things improve under this president and for 8 years, and there is a frustration that has built up there. And some of these long-held political dynasties and cities run by Democrats, these are African Americans talking, are not happy with how things are going. How does that factor in?
That's very real. And, you know, I would point to schools and failed schools in big cities run by Democrats and oftentimes by black mayors as evidence of that. The question is, where does the black vote go? I mean, at the moment, Obama has tremendous black support, a supermajority, if you will, but also you stop and think about loyalty to the Democratic Party. It's in place. Question.
I know, but they can't make the case that things are better, right? I mean, they can't make the case that these African-American communities are thriving under 8 years of President Obama, can they?
Well, they do. In fact, the numbers, the polls show that if I think it's close to 60% of black Americans think that we have made a lot of progress, things are getting better. The question is about the black poor. It's about the Latino poor. Very high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, high incarceration rates. That is a real point of concern. And then, of course, that leads us directly to the interaction with the police and whether people feel that they are being treated fairly by the police and whether or not any kind of stereotyping, stigma, profiling that attaches to the treatment of black and Latino poor, especially the boys, the stop and frisk argument that you're familiar with, then extends out to the 40-year-old. Both of the people who were killed this week, Brett, in their 40s, were they just lumped in as, oh, well, that's a threatening black male figure, as opposed to an individual deserving of protection from the police?
Right. Juan, thank you. We are continuing our coverage here on Fox News Channel of the situation in Charlotte. We're sorry we didn't get back out to Bill O'Reilly in California. He will be back tomorrow as we are closing in on the debate on Monday. We have full coverage, America's election headquarters on Fox. Megyn Kelly is up next.